bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the January 21st, 2025 episode. For this episode, my guest is Peter Lawrence. Peter is Novogradac's Director of Public Policy and Government Relations. At the time of this recording, Donald Trump was to be sworn in as the 47th President of the United States on Monday, January 20th, which is the day before the podcast we are recording today is scheduled to be posted. With the inauguration of Donald Trump, the Republican sweep is complete. With that, the Republican Party should control the congressional agenda for the next 2 years. Now, some of our listeners and viewers might be thinking, why do you say should, Mike? And that's, of course, because the majority in the Senate is 3 senators and majority in the House is quite narrow. And depending upon the health and well-being of Republican members, we would expect the control to be Republican for the next 2 years. But stranger things have happened, as they say. Now, with major tax legislation scheduled to expire at the end, or at least parts of major tax legislation scheduled to expire at the end of this year. And of course, by major tax legislation, I'm referring to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, particularly with respect to a number of high-profile individual tax provisions. With that major tax legislation scheduled to expire, we expect it to be major tax legislation to be enacted sometime this year. And it could slide over into early 2026. And with that, we also expect that major tax legislation to extend large portions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act to be done on a partisan basis. That is, without Democratic support, partisan basis, and that Republicans only will vote for the bill, and Democrats will not vote for the bill. This would be done through budget reconciliation, which is a means we've talked about on prior podcasts. That means in the Senate, the Republicans only need 50 votes plus the vice president. And in the House, they need a simple majority. That being said, it's not a given that the Republicans, given the narrow majority in the House, can ultimately pass a tax bill on a partisan basis. But we'll have much more to talk about that in future podcasts, as well as we'll be blog posting on it. We'll be talking about it at our conferences, and there'll be a lot of debate over that question over the coming months ahead. But that's not the focus of this podcast. The fact that there will be a major tax bill to avoid over 62% of Americans getting a tax increase in 2026, we will have a vehicle that will allow for the opportunity to expand and improve existing affordable housing and other community development tax incentives. One area that we do expect to see legislation on is opportunity zones. That said, the focus of this podcast is that a major tax bill provides an opportunity for a number of new ideas that are out there in the country to help with community development and affordable housing. So in this podcast, we will discuss 4 possible incentives that could be included in a coming tax bill. We'll talk about the likelihood of these, as well as discuss specifically what each one is, and then talk about the likelihood and share any of the historical efforts that have been made to enact these incentives in prior Congresses. Now, the 4 we're going to talk about is first, a new incentive that doesn't have a bill yet, but it's a preservation tax incentive that we at Novogradac have been working with a number of other key players to get introduced into Congress and to see to what extent we can get included as part of the major tax bill. Once again, it's a preservation of affordable housing tax incentive. The second one that we'll discuss is the neighborhood homes tax credit. We've discussed that in prior podcasts, and we'll go into that in its likelihood. And we'll also provide a link to our prior podcast on the neighborhood homes tax credit. The third item, or the third possible new provision, is a workforce housing tax credit, which is a housing tax credit designed for workforce housing. And then the fourth is a tax credit that would incentivize the conversion of office space into housing. Now, as I noted, we're going to outline each incentive at a super high level, and we'll talk about the forecast or possible sponsors for each of these ideas. And we'll look at, if enacted, who might work in each of these areas. As you can tell, we have a lot to cover with these 4 incentives. So if you're ready, let's get started. Peter, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thank you, Mike.
You're a frequent guest, not a guest as much as Tony Grapponi, thanks to the Renewable Energy Tax Finance series, but you're obviously up there. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, as I like to begin every podcast, please share with our listeners a little more about what you do at Novograd.
I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations here at Novograd, and in that role, I help coordinate the federal policy activities of the firm in our practice areas, being affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and renewable and clean energy. And as such, I spend a lot of my time dealing with key members of Congress, as well, especially the tax writing committees, as well as key parts of the administration, the federal agencies that oversee those practice areas, particularly Treasury and COD and others. And I do also work in concert with a fair number of policy coalitions that are involved in these practice areas to make sure that we are working in sync with our allies to advance our policy proposals and objectives. And I'll just also say I have a number of opportunities to be involved in engagement. So if you're interested, if you got a public policy problem you need solved, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to discuss the possible policy engagement.
Great. Thank you for that. And maybe say a bit about, serving as advisors for our various working groups.
Yes, I'm part of, I help provide policy and regulatory updates to each of our policy working groups. The Low Income Housing Tax Credit Working Group, the New Markets Tax Credit Working Group, the Opportunity Zones Working Group, the Renewable Energy Working Group, and the Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit Working Group, which we'll talk about some more later onwards. And we are also always thinking about new working groups, and we're in the process of setting one up to talk about preservation tax incentive you talk about.
Yep. Yes, thank you for that. And I'll also note that Peter also provides cameos when it's appropriate for the income limits working group. So we have a number of working groups here at Novograd that Peter and his team advise. So let's jump into the focus of the podcast, which are these 4 existing or potentially new tax provisions. And we picked these 4 because at some level we think these are the 4 most likely, or I wouldn't even say most likely, I'll just say of the various possible new incentives, these are the 4 that I do think have the highest chance of getting incorporated into a tax bill this year or early next year. That said, we do recognize that it's easier to enact enhancements to existing tax provisions to extend them and modernize them than it is to create and pass a new tax provision, particularly, in the coming tax discussions. The cost to extend so many of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act provisions that are expiring is going to be a very large number, and getting new additional items in will be a challenge. And as a general matter, our own experience has been that it takes many years often for an idea to ripen to the point of getting included and enacted. But that said, this is an opportunity to advance new proposals, and we'd be foolish not to be pushing forth with these 4 areas. Let's start with the first one, and it's the newest kid on the block, as they often say, and that's a preservation tax incentive. And I say preservation tax incentive, not preservation tax credit, because it's not a tax credit. It deals with tax losses. Peter, if you could give a high-level overview, and you and I have spoken in the various areas where we'll go an hour or 2 hours explaining the incentive and all of its intricacies. Not that it's complicated. It's just there's always a little bit more you can discuss when you get into the details. But please give the audience an overview of the preservation tax incentive and the issues it's designed to correct or provide funding for.
Absolutely, Mike. And yes, and certainly if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out and I'll be more than happy to get into a fuller accounting and definitely encourage those of you who are interested in this idea to join our information working group, where we'll be talking about it on a regular basis, help push it forward. But as you put out, Mike, obviously one of the most important incentives that exist right now for the preservation of existing affordable rental housing is the low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt perpetuity bonds. But one thing we've seen in recent years is an increasing percentage of those resources are being used for new construction. And that's also really important too. We have a affordable housing supply deficit in this country, and we're just not building enough. And so there's definitely a huge need for new construction. And states have been, using the resource they have under their control for the housing credit bonds to help address that new construction. But what that's left is there's less of those resources available for preservation. And this is particularly marked with the private activity bonds, which historically had been the resource most often used for preservation. There are many areas in the country where they're devoting the entire set of bonds for new construction. I'll note, New York City, a big area, obviously, definitely needs new construction in that market. They've decided to use the entire private activity bonds for new construction. And so, given that less and less resources, and given the fact that more and more existing affordable rental housing is coming, end of their tax credit period for year 15, or their rental assistance contracts are expiring, their favorable mortgages are expiring. There's a lot of housing out there that needs preservation resources. So, this proposal really is designed as a dedicated resource that would be as of right that nonprofits could plan upon using the tax losses that sort of notionally exist in their property portfolio right now to help assist in their preservation. And, we've gotten, I think, a good set of support initially out there in the affordable housing community because there is a growing recognition about the importance of having a dedicated resource for preservation. But as you pointed out, Mike, it is the new kid on the block, and it takes often some time for the new kids on the block to get sufficiently socialized to be able to advance. But we feel very positive about this idea, given this growing need and given how it's constructed to help, sort of really tap a resource that sort of exists notionally in properties today.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. And I'll just add the tax accountant in me's breaking out here. In many ways, this is looking back at 1986 or the Tax Reform Act in 1986, when annual housing construction, this would be used just for renovation and preservation, but the national housing construction of units was much higher than it is now. And that's obviously, 40 years ago, and we were clipping along at a much higher rate than we are today with a much smaller population and the rest. And for those of you that weren't around, I don't expect that many of you were before the 86 Act, there's a lot of syndications of tax losses to individuals. And what this provision would do was create a narrow exception to the passive activity rules to allow, nonprofits to form joint ventures to syndicate tax losses to individuals. And it's a way of raising capital from individuals, so it doesn't compete with the other tax credits. And the individuals would invest for the losses. And then as a consequence, the nonprofit could generate capital through these joint ventures to renovate and preserve existing properties at restricted rents and lower income levels for their residents. So once again, and if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to Peter or Karen Desterall within our public policy group, as we're forming a working group to address some of the operational issues and opportunities within this incentive. So Peter, let's move on to the next. That's the neighborhood homes tax credit. As you mentioned, we do have a working group already with respect to the neighborhood homes tax credit. And with the various incentives, this is the oldest new kid on the block. So please describe the neighborhood homes tax credit, what it's designed to do, and roughly how it works.
Well, it's a proposal that is very much inspired by the low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit. But the difference here is that it is designed to develop, incentivize the construction or the acquisition rehab of owner-occupied housing, especially in distressed communities across the country. It's designed to cover what's often referred to as the appraisal gap. The cost to either construct or to acquire and rehab properties in some areas of the country costs more than what they can sell for, and that provides sort of a bit of a market failure, and these neighborhoods then end up being disinvested, and not only are they not being used for owner occupied housing, they bring down the value of neighboring properties as well. So this idea about creating a tax credit to develop single family housing has been around actually for a while. There was a version of this had advanced during the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, and it did get a lot of support in Congress, and it came close to being enacted, but unfortunately didn't quite make it. And this was just before, to give a quick little history lesson, the big foreclosure crisis, mortgage crisis, which did sort of set it back some years, but it's now come back as the market has changed. And we are, ever since that crisis in 2008, 2009, we simply have not been building enough single family or multifamily housing for that matter. And really, I think the time and the opportunity for an incentive like this has never been better given our current market situation. And so it's gotten steadily more and more support as it was introduced in the sort of newest incarnation as the neighborhood homes tax credit. And I think it has a very good chance of being considered in tax legislation this year.
So the housing preservation proposal that I mentioned first in this order there's not a bill that's been introduced yet. We're still working on that. Neighborhood homes tax credit has been introduced for many sessions of Congress. It just maybe even has a bit of groundwork for or level setting for our audience. Every 2 years, bills that have been introduced in the House and the Senate have to be reintroduced because that Congress ends. So these bills haven't been introduced yet. However, we expect them to be introduced shortly. But Peter, with respect to the neighborhood homes tax credit, if you could I know you can, so please let our audience know who the lead sponsors were last Congress.
Yes, the lead sponsors of the legislation in the House were Representatives Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania and John Larson of Connecticut, both of which are senior members of the tax writing House Ways and Means Committee. In fact, Representative Kelly is the chair of the tax subcommittee, so he's a particularly influential member of that committee. Not only was he also chair of that tax subcommittee, he was the chair of the House Republican Community Development Tax Team, which was charged through the course of last year to develop proposals in anticipation that Congress would become controlled by Republicans and advance tax legislation through reconciliation. So he was a particularly well-placed, influential member of Congress to advance this proposal. And his district, centered on Erie, Pennsylvania, and northwest Pennsylvania from Lake Erie down to the Pittsburgh suburbs. Great examples of the neighborhoods that this proposal would be very much targeting to address. And so, great champion of this initiative. Over on the Senate, the lead sponsor is Senator Todd Young of Indiana, who has been known as sort of one of the foremost policymakers on housing and affordable housing in the Senate. And he is expected to, again, the bill hasn't been introduced yet. And the champion in the last Congress was retiring Maryland Senator Ben Cardin, and he is likely to be replaced by his colleague, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. Again, both Senators Young and Warner are members of the Senate Finance Committee, the tax writing committee in the Senate, well, both are passionate about affordable housing, and that's why we're bullish on the possibility of the neighborhood homes being enacted this Congress.
It's also worth reminding our audience that you and I were able to had the privilege of briefing the House tax team on community development on this and some of the other proposals that we're discussing in the podcast today, as well as I had the privilege of testifying for the Senate Finance Committee last year. And as part of my testimony on the role of tax incentives in community development and housing, I was able to discuss some of these provisions as well. Let's turn to our third, the workforce housing tax credit. And the workforce housing tax credit is what the name kind of suggests. If you're not familiar with it, it's patterned after the long-term housing tax credit, but it's designed to provide workforce housing. And obviously, as many of our listeners know, the luxury tax credit does provide workforce housing as well, but this is designed to provide a higher, slightly expanded eligible tenant base, going up to 100% of very median incomes. Peter, please describe for our audience the history of the workforce housing tax credit and who some of the core supporters are in the House and the Senate.
Happy to do that. And, the workforce housing tax credit is extraordinarily very similar to the long-term housing tax credit. But what we've seen, the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies every year puts out its State of the Nation's Housing, as well as some sort of interim updates as well through the course of the year. And one thing they continue to document is how housing cost burdens have been continuing to go up and up the income ladder. And, this is the very symptomatic of our challenging housing, especially rental housing market we have. And the workforce housing tax credit is really a proposal that's designed to address the fact that households earning just above, the traditional long-term housing tax credit income limits often struggle to find affordable housing as well. And in many respects, there's almost a little bit of a policy blind spot because so many programs are designed to serve, families either at or below 60% or at or below 80%. That if you are just above that, you really can be challenged in that you still have a fairly modest income, and yet the rents available, in the unsubsidized marketplace are still, very, very high. And so this proposal essentially would provide a new pool of tax credit authority to the states, just like they have for the local housing tax credit. And each state could choose to say, you can choose to supplement our existing housing credit programs with this pool, or we could use it for this, given what the needs in our particular state are such that they want to prioritize serving those households just above the traditional limits. And not only that, states could choose to combine resources, so have a mixed income property which had some housing credits associated with it, or some workforce housing credits associated with it. And that way you can sort of address both needs in the same building. And that often also provides for, a better balance for that particular property, having, a variety of households served. There's plenty of research shown that often has a more successful property than ones that are, focused on only one income demographic. And so, this proposal has been introduced for several years now, several Congresses. Certainly, the first and foremost leader of the proposal is the former Senate Finance Committee Chairman, now ranking member, Ron Wyden from Oregon. And Oregon certainly has been one state that has really experienced tremendous increase in rental housing challenges, including for those, households earning above the traditional housing credit income limits. He is joined in the Senate by Dan Sullivan from Alaska. Alaska is not a state that people normally think of, but you'd be surprised to note how challenging it is to develop rental housing in Alaska. And, the resource like this would be very, very helpful in trying to make sure that key, especially first responder professions, have a chance of living in the communities they serve. In the House, the proposal is championed by Jimmy Panetta from the Central Coastal California. And he's also a leader, by the way, low-income housing tax credit legislation. And he is joined by, as his House Republican counterpart, by Mike Carey from the Columbus, Ohio suburbs. And Mike Carey certainly has already, he's a relatively newer member of the Ways and Means Committee, but he's established himself as a key supporter of affordable housing community development. And so those are the four champions of the workforce housing tax credit.
Thank you for that, Peter. Now, if I'm a frequent listener, I might be thinking, I heard something in the past about a middle income housing tax credit. How is this different than the middle income housing tax credit?
It's not. Short answer, it's the new name. I think members of Congress feel like, well, middle income doesn't sound like a demographic that needs assistance. And so sort of to really focus in on what the proposal is really trying to solve is changing the name. That's often happens all the time here in Congress. Congress is very, very conscious about how proposals are called. And so, there is clearly many members of Congress are concerned about making sure that key types of households have an ability to find affordable housing that they can't in their particular states and districts. And as you point out, Mike, plenty, in fact, I would say practically all folks who live in low-income housing tax credit properties also work.
Right.
There is I think, a growing recognition that there are families and then some communities too. You can have, believe it or not, two adults working full time at the state's minimum wage that earn too much for the low-income housing tax credit. And so, having an ability to serve those types of households that are earning just above the traditional limits are also, working. No one wants to see someone who is, households that are working full time not be able to afford affordable housing.
And I do also think the revisions are more descriptive, just like the low income housing tax credit. One of the provisions of the Affordable Credit Improvement Act is to change the name to the Affordable Housing Tax Credit, because really the focus is to create, affordable housing for low income persons. And just like this, and you think middle income, it's like, what's middle? And clearly, as you point out, it's designed to provide workforce housing that is affordable. So let's turn to our fourth tax provision that would provide resources for affordable housing. And that is dealing with an issue that, many parts of the nation are facing. I say many parts, I'd probably say every part of the nation is facing, and that's the reduced demand for office buildings post-COVID. There's been a question as to what to do with those office buildings. There's been a lot of efforts, a lot of theorizing about converting offices to housing. And this isn't a podcast about the pros and the cons of converting office space to housing and what types of office space is more readily convertible into housing versus what types of office space, given the physical structures, aren't possible economically to convert to housing. But it is a given in many areas that the economics of converting it to housing don't work, and certainly don't work if you're going to be converting it to affordable housing. Hence, entered the scene a office conversion tax credit. So Peter, if you wanted to share a bit of the history of this incentive and a little bit more about the concept, I would appreciate it.
Sure, happy to do so. And Mike, as you point out, really the economy post-COVID has changed pretty dramatically. I don't know how many, we wouldn't have so many Zoom meetings as we had before COVID. This podcast itself is a demonstration of how work has changed in recent years. And given that reality, and that, there's less of a demand for office properties and other commercial real estate, there are a lot of distressed commercial properties sitting there being very unproductive in many communities. And we have an affordable housing crisis. So it doesn't take much rocket science to think maybe, we can link and solve two problems at once. Of course, it is, as you point out, Mike, not always as easy as it sounds. And, we're not going to get into the whole discussion about that, but Congress, to at least incentivize the best properties that are most able to make that transition, has proposed allocating $15 billion to state housing agencies to help cover the costs associated with conversion. And this proposed credit is very much inspired by the federal historic preservation tax credit in many ways, in that it does provide a 20% credit for certain costs of renovation to convert that property. And of that 15 billion, 12 would be allocated to states by formula. And then an extra 3 billion would be set aside for the most impacted areas of the country to be able to stretch that money yet further. And it's got, I think, some promise. It's got some big industry heavy hitters behind it, like the National Association of Realtors and mortgage bankers, as they recognize there's all this loans on these properties that are coming due. And it's not clear how they're going to go forward over the long term, given the change in the economy. So I think there's definitely a good base of support for this idea. And this could be an exciting resource out there to help address the two needs at the same time, and helping removing distressed properties from communities across the country at the same time, create new, or at least adapt properties for affordable housing. I suppose I should also just go
Yes,
roll
I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
and the legislation is led by, again, Mike Carey. It's another example of his leadership on housing community development from the Columbus, Ohio suburbs. And this time he is joined by Jimmy Gomez, who represents downtown LA, obviously, clearly one of the areas that has been affected by the change in the economy, the change prompted by COVID. In the Senate, the proposals was led by retiring Senator Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, but she was joined by Senator Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada, who still is in Congress, and both Senator Stabenow and Senator Cortez Masto still is on the tax running Senate Finance Committee. And we know that there's going to be efforts to bring along a new Senate Finance Republican, joint sponsor in the coming weeks and months.
So as you look in your crystal ball, Peter, I'm sure your crystal ball is a little bit cloudy. Mine is certainly cloudy. And there are times when I feel like it's becoming less cloudy, only for it to get cloudier again. And I have no doubt that as the year proceeds, it'll go through its degrees of cloudiness until a bill is passed and signed by the president. With that said, when you look at your crystal ball, what's your forecast? Or what are you seeing with respect to each of these incentives? Bearing in mind that about a year from now, we'll be able to go back and listen to this podcast and check out your thoughts.
Yes. Well, famous always last words is always to say, whenever you predict anything about Congress, you could be wrong in the next 15 minutes afterwards. With that in mind, as you point out, if Congress does not act by early January, over 60% of American taxpayers will get a tax increase. And, given that, Republicans have control of the federal government, the White House, House and Senate, at least, albeit how narrowly, there's no one they can blame for the situation other than themselves. And so I think given that reality, that there's tremendous pressure on House Republicans to make sure they act on tax legislation this year. And the scope is huge. I mean, we just learned recently the latest estimates. If Congress were to extend everything from the Cuts and Jobs Act that expires at the end of this year. It would cost $5.5 trillion over 10 years. That's even that's a pretty good amount of money, even in federal budget terms. And so, given the size of that issue, that's not necessarily going to say that Congress is going to go ahead and extend everything fully on a permanent basis. But it does mean they've got a lot to consider. And the size of the legislation they're likely to consider is going to be large. And it's always easier to fit something in a large piece of legislation than a small tax bill. Those are that's a much harder thing to get something new into a small bill. And so I think, given that, all these proposals have a chance. Of the ones, I would say that the Neighborhood Homes seems to have probably the best chance, given that it's got more co-sponsors and this has a lot of history behind it and need. But that's not to say the other ideas don't have a chance at all either. We've seen great ideas that can sometimes catch an opportunity that's unexpected. Opportunity zones incentive, as you both of us know very, very well, was just an idea back in 2017. Didn't have a clear passage to enactment, and then suddenly it did. And here we are, 8 years later, and it's now established itself as a key community development tax incentive. So never say never, Mike, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you've got to act as if they're going to get in. And you and I have discussed before, a number of years ago, the Senate Finance Committee was working on a tax bill that everyone thought wasn't going to go anywhere, but some advocates pushed hard to get their incentives into that Senate Finance Committee approved bill. Others said, well, that bill's not going anywhere. I'm not going to spend time. Lo and behold, December came around. I think it was December. They were dealing with finalizing budget matters and all the rest. And they wanted to deal with a number of tax issues, and they just took the Senate bill and attached it. And there were many tax lobbyists that were chagrined, and they said, well, we didn't think that bill was going anywhere, so we didn't focus on getting in it. And it turned out to be enacted as is. So you've got to assume you're going to be successful and move forward so that if there is an opportunity, you seize it. Let me tell our audience, this will bring this to a close here. To our audience, if you have questions, please email them to cpas@noco.com. Also, feel free to reach out to me on my LinkedIn or Twitter @Novogradic if you have questions. And before we wrap up, Peter, I did want you to share anything else you wanted listeners to know about these 4 incentives and or other resources available.
Happy to do so, Mike. I did want to once again reiterate, we do have a working group in formation to help support the preservation tax incentive proposal. Please feel free to contact me at peter.lawrence@nc-llp.com if you're interested in joining it as it gets formed. Of course, we do already have a Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit Working Group, which is meeting, and we'd be more than happy if you're more interested in learning more about that incentive to join that. And then on those 2 new proposals, Mike, we are actually addressing and discussing them in the context of our LIHTC working groups. So if you're interested in learning more about those proposals, please feel free to reach out and join that group as well. And I do want to just note that, for other policy issues, I'm more than happy to help you out in an engagement to address that. Often these ideas help get started up in those types of engagements. And I do want to note that our next affordable housing conference, where we'll be talking about a lot of status, could be that we're in the heat of tax reform at that conference. Mike, on May 8th and 9th in San Francisco. We really encourage folks to register to that conference to learn more.
Before we get to I want to transition to the off mic section, which is a fun part of every episode. It's become a great tradition, thanks to my partner, Tony Raponi. Before we jump to that, To our listeners and viewers watching us on YouTube or listening to us, your favorite podcast platform, please do subscribe to the show so you're sure to get every episode. And then when you have a time to listen to it, it'll already be downloaded. I also like to encourage, so I'll do that now, our audience to share the podcast with your colleagues, those who might also be interested in the various development and affordable housing and renewable energy tax issues that we discussed. And as I also say frequently, we do have a full archive of episodes available on our website at novoco.com. So let's now close with our off mic section. And as I noted, this is a space that we get to give a shout out to someone that we work with in one or more of the various incentives, who is doing a strong job of representing the sort of incentives themselves well, in serving to ensure that they're as robust as possible and assisting communities in need. So with that, Peter, who would you like to give a shout out to?
Well, Mike, as you know, we just came back from our first housing conference of the year in Fort Lauderdale, which is a great conference. And one of the key partners we invited and worked with at that conference is Ariane Parks from Enterprise Community Partners. She is co-chair of the Affordable Rental Housing Action Campaign, which is the big tent coalition of coalitions that is focused on advancing the low-income housing tax credit and the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So she's a key leader in the efforts to advance housing credit legislation. And we're very happy to work with her, during the conference and of course throughout the year. And so as such, I'd love to make her my call up for this podcast.
Thank you for that, Peter. I'll give a shout out as well to Ariane. Not only is she doing great work in the affordable housing space, she also in her prior life and some of her life now, she was with the New Market, with Posen Associates, and worked with the New Market Tax Credit Coalition, promoting the New Market Tax Credit. Obviously another community development tax incentive that we work with her at Novogradac. So great work, Ariane, and look forward to the efforts and your work in the coming years ahead. Thank you, Peter, for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.
And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.